Fulgencio Batista was a Cuban military officer and politician who played a significant role in the history of Cuba during the mid-20th century. He served as the de facto ruler and later as the president of Cuba for 2 non-consecutive terms. Batista was born into a poor family in Baines, Cuba, and began his military career at a young age. He rose through the ranks and became a sergeant in the Cuban army. In 1933, he participated in the Sergeants' Revolt, a military coup that toppled the ruling government and brought a short-lived period of military rule in Cuba. In 1940, Cuba adopted a new constitution, and Batista handed over power to a civilian government. However, despite this transition to civilian rule, Batista remained influential in Cuban politics and maintained control over the armed forces. In 1952, Batista staged a coup against the government of President Carlos Prio Socarrás and seized power once again. This time, instead of restoring civilian rule, Batista established himself as the de facto ruler of Cuba, assuming control of the government and dissolving the Cuban Congress. This move effectively ended Cuba's democratic institutions and established an authoritarian regime. During his second term in power, Batista's government was marked by corruption, repression, and close ties to American business interests. He allowed large American corporations to dominate Cuba's economy, particularly in industries like sugar and mining, leading to further social and economic inequality in the country. Despite significant economic growth during his tenure, the benefits of this growth were not distributed evenly, leading to widespread poverty and discontent among the Cuban population. As opposition to Batista's regime grew, a number of opposition groups, including Fidel Castro's revolutionary movement, sought to overthrow his government. Fidel Castro, a charismatic lawyer and activist, was critical of Batista's dictatorship and led a failed uprising against it in 1953, known as the Moncada Barracks attack. Although the attack was unsuccessful, it brought Castro and his revolutionary ideals into the spotlight. After being captured and later released, Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he continued to organize and train a revolutionary force to overthrow Batista. In 1956, Castro and a group of around 80 armed revolutionaries, including Che Guevara, returned to Cuba on a yacht called the Granma and initiated a guerrilla war against Batista's government in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Over the next 2 years, the rebel forces gained popular support among some sections of the Cuban population, particularly among peasants and the working class, due to their promises of social justice, land reform, and an end to corruption. As the revolution gained momentum, Batista's regime faced increasing challenges and lost support from both the Cuban population and the international community. The US government, once a staunch ally of Batista, began to distance itself from his regime, especially as the Cuban people rallied behind the revolutionaries. In January 1959, after a series of military defeats and mounting pressure, Batista fled Cuba, and Fidel Castro's forces entered Havana triumphantly, marking the end of the revolution and the beginning of Castro's rule. The US initially extended cautious recognition to Castro's government, hoping that he would establish a democratic system and maintain friendly relations with the US. However, Castro's increasingly radical policies, nationalization of American-owned businesses, and alignment with the Soviet Union alarmed US policymakers. Tensions escalated, and the US-Cuba relationship deteriorated rapidly. By the early 1960s, the US government viewed Castro's government as a threat to American interests in the region and to its broader anti-communist agenda during the Cold War. This, coupled with Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union, led to a policy of containment and attempts to undermine his regime. In April 1961, the US supported various covert operations of Cuban exiles known as the Bay of Pigs, backed by the CIA, in an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime. The invasion was a failure and resulted in significant embarrassment for the United States. But in response, Castro strengthened ties with the Soviet Union, leading to a series of events that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. After the Bay of Pigs debacle, the Soviet Union saw an opportunity to extend its influence in the Western Hemisphere and provide military assistance to Cuba. In the following months, the Soviet leadership decided to station nuclear missiles on the island, seeing it as a strategic move to counterbalance the US's nuclear capabilities in Turkey and Italy, which were in close proximity to the Soviet Union. This decision marked a dangerous escalation in the Cold War. In October 1962, US intelligence discovered evidence of Soviet missile installations in Cuba, including photographic proof of the construction of missile sites. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors deliberated over the best course of action, knowing that the presence of nuclear missiles in Cuba posed a severe threat to the security of the United States. Kennedy had several options on the table, ranging from a full-scale invasion of Cuba to a naval blockade to prevent further missile deliveries. After intense debate and consideration, the president opted for a naval blockade, officially termed a quarantine, to prevent additional Soviet shipments from reaching Cuba. In a televised address in October, Kennedy informed the American people of the presence of the missiles and explained the measures the US was taking to address the crisis. He warned that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba would be seen as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States and that it would trigger a full-scale response. This public statement demonstrated the seriousness of the situation and the resolve of the US government to defend its territory and interests. For 13 tense days, the world watched as the crisis unfolded. The US Navy began enforcing the quarantine, stopping and inspecting ships bound for Cuba. The world held its breath, fearing that any miscalculation or misunderstanding could lead to a catastrophic nuclear war between the two superpowers. Behind the scenes, diplomacy played a crucial role in seeking a peaceful resolution. Kennedy's administration engaged in secret negotiations with the Soviet Union through back-channel communication, exploring possible ways to resolve the crisis without resorting to military action. The Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, eventually agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public commitment from the US not to invade the island and, secretly, the removal of US Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The crisis came to an end in October when Khrushchev announced his decision to dismantle the missile sites in Cuba. The US in turn fulfilled its private promise to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The world let out a collective sigh of relief as the immediate threat of nuclear confrontation dissipated. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a profound impact on the Cold War dynamics. Both the US and the Soviet Union realized the perils of brinkmanship and the need for better communication and mechanisms to prevent similar crises in the future. As a result, a direct hotline was established between Washington, D.C. and Moscow to facilitate immediate communication between the leaders of both nations. The crisis led to a period of détente, marked by increased dialogue and arms control agreements between the US and the Soviet Union. These measures helped ease tensions and reduce the risk of nuclear war, making the Cuban Missile Crisis a pivotal moment in history that demonstrated the dangerous consequences of unchecked escalation between nuclear powers. It also served as a stark reminder of the necessity for diplomacy, communication, and the pursuit of peaceful resolutions to international conflicts. The lessons learned from this crisis continue to shape global relations and international diplomacy to this day. Or does it?